Michael Vannen, and welcome to the Palantir podcast, the broadcasting arm of GHG Palantir, which is an offshoot of the Grey Havens Group, Inc., a nonprofit out of Colorado, which encourages literacy and imagination. We continue our discussion of the Silmarillion with Chapter 8 of the Darkening of Valinor. This chapter is extremely short, but also extremely important, because it is the moment when everything starts moving, when the story really takes off, the catalyst which starts the avalanche. The story of this chapter is essentially broken into three segments. You have the beginning, which deals with Melkor going to the south of Valinor to Avathar, a realm that is dark and unreachable by the light of the two trees, to find the creature Ungoliant. There he negotiates with her to help him in fighting or seeking vengeance against the Valar by destroying the two trees. So they head north to Valinor, and then we break for a description of a festival held during harvest, in which all the elves and all the Valar end up in the palace of Manwë on the Mount of Taniquetil. And during this time, there is a reconciliation that occurs between Fëanor and Fingolfin, in which the two brothers, perhaps grudgingly, perhaps willingly, reconcile and welcome each other back into the fold. During this time, Melkor and Ungoliant, in the third section, descend onto the plain of Valinor and head off to Valmar and the two trees which stand before it, and kill the two trees, causing all of Valinor, and indeed all of the world, to essentially descend into darkness. Ungoliant is described as essentially being a spider-like figure, one which consumes light and belches forth darkness, a darkness which is a physical element, tangible, and like webs, similar to what we see with Shelob in her lair in the chapter The Lair of Shelob, I believe it is. Anyways, in that Frodo and Sam end up being entrapped in, while they pass up to the Tower of Cirith Ungol. We don't know where she comes from. We don't really even know what she is. But she greatly loathes and loves, just like Melkor, the element of light. And so when they kill the two trees, she consumes the light, which is the blood of the two trees, as well as the vat of their dew, which sits before them. And as she drinks, she grows in power and might, and also in darkness, and belches forth that darkness. And therefore, when the Valar understand what has occurred and go to catch Ungoliant and Melkor as they escape from the destruction of the two trees, they are stopped and caught in the darkness, and so unable to catch them. What's interesting here is how this continues the theme of light and dark, in terms of not only as physical elements which can be crafted and used, but also as demarcations of time. Because this is the first time we really get a sense of there actually being a sequence of time. Because we get the festival which the Valar have instituted centered around the harvest. Now, as we've discussed in previous meetings, we don't really fully understand or know, given that we are to understand that this is a record being compiled and written by elves in after ages, how time actually was understood or passed or demarcated in this early age. And yet, presumably, through a sort of keep it simple, stupid logic, why would Yavanna change the course of the seasons, the course of the maturation of crops to make the harvest different? So presumably we can look at the passage of years during this period as similar to our own. Because remember, this is a secondary work built off of the primary world and the workings of the primary world. And therefore, we can reasonably look at the information Tolkien has given us and fill in the blanks with knowledge from our own world to come to some form of understanding of what is occurring in his secondary world. And therefore, we can begin to look at this and finally reach a point in which we have a almost human understanding of the passage of time. Before this point, it's similar to the experience that Sam and Frodo have upon leaving Lothlorien, of not understanding and not being able to grasp at the reality that they've been in Lothlorien for 2 months. Also, this is an interesting moment where we can begin to look at the relationship between the music of the beginning, the music of the Ainur, and the events that are occurring. Tolkien discusses actual musical events within the music, of discord, of cacophony, of harmony, of homophonous sound, meaning that everything's kind of flowing along together, of many melodies running together, whether contrary or harmonious with one another, of moments of descant, of moments of discord, of moments of complete chaos, of moments of sound, of moments of pause, and of moments of slowness and speed. And one of the things he discusses is this idea where the rebellion, the music that makes up the rebellion of Melkor, finds harmony or finds a relationship at which the music of the theme of Ilúvatar corresponds in some way with the music of Melkor. And this can be done in a way that creates a greater harmony, or in a way that seemingly run together and yet run in opposite directions, like a descant. And we kind of discussed in our meeting on this portion of how do we see this? How do we see the events of this chapter? Is it one of those moments of greater glory where the two meld together? Or is it a moment of cacophony where they're running completely contrary and there's no relation? Is it a moment of Melkor's ascendancy, which would seem to be the case? Or is it a moment of the two running side by side? Another thing that we can look at here is a case of a primordial black breath. When we look at Ungoliant and the fumes that she produces, the effects in many ways are much more physical in terms of holding back characters like Tolkien from actually pursuing them. but has much the same effect of disheartening, of tying you up, of causing confusion and a despair. The question, of course, is when this conception of her breath came versus the idea of the breath of the Nazgul. Presumably, Ungoliant came first. So the argument can be made, or the question asked, of a sort of chicken and egg situation. Which came first, and how do they relate? Is this something to do with the nature of Ungoliant? Or is it something to do with the nature of one who has so subsumed themselves within darkness and so entered into a realm of being a wraith and neglecting and falling out of the physical sphere of the world, that this is then an ability that they gain? Also, one of the interesting things here that we can look at with Ungoliant is, again, we have a character who is an other, with a capital O, very much like the other that we all know and love, and misunderstand, and can't find an answer to, and yet love to discuss, which is Tom Bombadil. Ungoliant is very much a character in this vein, and we're even told so, that even for the elves themselves and those who live around her, it's just as confusing. When we are introduced to her as a character, we're told, the Eldar knew not whence she came, but some have said that in ages long before she descended from the darkness that lies about Arda, when Melkor first looked down in envy upon the kingdom of Manwë, and that in the beginning she was one of those that he corrupted to his service. But she had disowned her master, desiring to be mistress of her own lust, taking all things to herself to feed her emptiness, and she fled to the south, escaping the assaults of the Valar and the hunters of Orome, for their vigilance had ever been to the north, and the south was long unheeded. Thence she had crept towards the light of the blessed realm, for she hungered for light, and hated it. In a ravine she lived, and took shape as a spider of monstrous form, weaving her black webs in a cleft of the mountains. There she sucked up all the light that she could find, and spun it forth again in dark nets of strangling gloom, until no light more could come to her abode, and she was famished. What's intriguing here is the description would seem to imply, given that she came from the outer dark, that perhaps she could be numbered among one of the Ainur, possibly the lesser Ainur, one of the Maiar underneath Melkor. And indeed it is stated that at one point she was one of his followers, perhaps even one of his proteges. And in her proclivities, in her likings, in her lusts, she is remarkably similar. Just like Melkor, she hungers for light. But unlike Melkor, she hungers for it in order to consume it and belch it forth as darkness. Whereas Melkor would like to take all light and hoard it and own it unto himself, and hold it protected away from everyone else, and claim utter ownership over it. So you end up with a situation where you have Melkor in the north of the world and Ungoliant in the south, basically balancing each other with the Valar in between. We continued too with the discussion of the nature of the music and its relation to the ages of time that we have been discussing and running through at this phase in the story. And given the nature of this attack, which is primarily focused on light and the nature of light, began to perhaps see some link between the three themes that we have, the three movements, and the three phases that we have essentially of light and how light is produced in Middle Earth, in Arda. We have the two towers, the two lamps rather, then we have the two trees, and then we have the sun and moon. Three distinct phases of light giving, perhaps related to the three distinct movements of the music. The chapter is extremely visual and extremely cinematic in its description. And it's one of those chapters that you kind of have to see in your mind and imagine the events that are occurring. It is not a chapter that is static, and it is not a chapter by any means that is expository in nature. This is a chapter of action, and therefore when you read it, you should read it with that in mind, and it is primarily, given the nature of it, focused on light and dark, a visual chapter. And so it should be something we should begin to start to get that picture rolling in our head, because the descriptions that Tolkien gives are very powerful. And yet, as we often discuss in our meetings, given that we are all, Becky, Dan, and myself, are all very interested in the visual arts, one of the masterful things about Tolkien's writing is the fact that he gives you just enough information to be dangerous. He gives you a couple of elements which are critical to an understanding of what we should imagine, and leaves the rest of it vague enough that we all can have our own vision. We all can come up with, from the same text, and then when we look at the image, recognize it as being from the source text, and yet be completely alien and different images. It's one of the really interesting things when you look at Tolkien's work, and particularly look at its effect on illustration and art. Because you would think that perhaps there would be moments of agreement, that there would be certain things that would remain relatively static. And yet when you start digging and looking at what has been produced over the years, there is a vast and nearly endless seeming quantity of work to look at, all of which is drastically different. And not simply due to style, but due to the applicability that the specific artist found in the text, and how then that was interpreted. It's one of the things that makes Tolkien so interesting for someone who is interested in producing imagery. And perhaps one of the reasons why Tolkien himself had such an issue and so much concern with regards to who may or may not illustrate his work and how it should be done. Because we shouldn't produce a definitive image. There shouldn't be a set and done, but rather a core driven from the text which remains steady and is built upon as a framework, much like we saw in the music. We are given a theme on which we are to ornament and elaborate the image. And therefore, there's constant change. While that core remains the same, Just as in the case of applicability and concepts and linkages and metaphors which can be seen and read within Tolkien's work, the same functions through the imagery that can be created and understood. Until next time, where we will meet to discuss the flight of the Noldor.